Reform has launched a Christian fellowship. Is this a positive development, restoring the place of Christianity in public life, or is it a pernicious Americanization of our politics? To discuss this, I am joined by Tim Montgomerie, who is the honorary president of the Christian Fellowship. Tim, thank you so much for joining us. So let's begin with the basics. What is the Christian Fellowship and what is its vision?
Well, thank you first of all for having me. It's lovely to be with you. I think both of us have got slightly croaky voices, haven't we? So apologise to listeners if I'm sounding too croaky. It's that time of year. Well, look, makes me feel old, but 36 years ago, I formed the Conservative Christian Fellowship. And that was partly because I was at university then in Exeter with David Burrows, who later became a Conservative MP. We formed the Conservative Christian Fellowship together. And we really had two aims. One was sort of answer the question we were constantly asked: how can you be a Conservative and a Christian? And it may be questions we come on to. It's a question that is now asked of me as a reformer, how I can reconcile those two positions. But fundamentally, just as the Christian Fellowship for Reform is a fellowship, it was a Conservative Christian Fellowship. It's not a campaigning organisation. It is a fellowship. It's a place where Christians in reform can come together to pray, to support each other, to encourage each other, to equip each other. And we don't have policies. Reform obviously has policies, so we're semi-signed up to reform policies. But fundamentally, we are just a fellowship of believing Christians who believe that part of our response to the command to love our neighbour is to be involved in politics. And that's what we're doing.
So how, as you brought it up yourself, how would you reconcile, say, reform's policies on migration with Christianity? Because that's something I also get a lot is, how can you be anti-migration and a Christian? Doesn't Christ teach you to love your neighbour? Therefore, you must have open borders and let everybody in.
Yeah. Well, look, there's so many answers to this question because I don't agree with every reform policy, but the general thrust of the reform view that, Britain, one of the things that I think we can be proudest of in post-war Britain was the extent to which we integrated people who came here. I think, for most of my adult life, I don't think racism was much of an issue in British society. If you were at the wrong end of the decisions that the Home Office took on the Windrush scandal, you would disagree with that, perhaps. But generally, Britain became the society that Martin Luther King hoped America would become, a colourblind society. Now, of course, the race industry isn't so keen on colourblindness now. That's another question. But we integrated successfully. And just on a practical level, we haven't continued to integrate people successfully because at just a simple level of volume, primarily, although not just volume, too many people have come into the country, and those communities we haven't been as demanding of communities coming into Britain as we should have been, even on basic things like speaking English. So I think if you believe in what I've always believed in, an integrated, colourblind society, you would worry about the level of immigration. I think we have a duty to the poorest people of the world. I think one day at the end of the time, God will ask us what we did for the least of you. People who are hungry. There are people who are hungry in today's world. There are people who are dying of illnesses that are perfectly treatable. And I think it's one of the reasons why I still think we should have an aid budget. I still believe that we should give to the poorest people of the world. But no, I think there's a perfectly defensible position on immigration.
Why do you think so? In the case of some of the bishops who have come out and been quite strident in criticising people like Tommy Robinson, or you recently had this huge carol service in London, or those who have been marching with crosses. There have been some bishops who have been very outspoken of what they see as the politicization of Christianity around
Church of England bishops complaining about the politicization of religion. Oh, goodness me.
Do you think that actually that there's been this shift towards showing mercy to those from abroad and charity to those from abroad, but not having any sense of mercy and charity towards those who are already here? And if you do think that shift has taken place, why do you think that's happened?
I think your question answers itself in a way. I think it definitely has been. I don't know quite where it comes from. I don't think I have an adequate answer for why it's happened. But There is, in broad sections of British society, there does seem to be an embarrassment about British history. And there are many aspects of British history that should shame us. But my political hero is William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce was someone who saw the slave trade and fought against it. And it took a 40-year campaign of his, from first of all fighting the slave trade, then to fighting slavery itself, for him to succeed. But he fought it. And Britain fought the slave trade.
And importantly, he was a Christian.
And he was a Christian, yes. We might come on to that more. He is my political hero, by the way, full stop.
So what...
I think there's a lot of people in education, in the church, who only remember the worst parts of British history and somehow feel we have to compensate for that. And I think part of their compensation seems to be that any immigrant that wants to come to Britain should be welcomed in. And actually, I think I don't agree with that. I think it's a wrong motivation. I think we should be an outward-looking nation that tries to work for a better, safer, more prosperous, secure world. But there are other ways of helping the poor and the vulnerable than opening our borders. And there are plenty of people inside Britain, as your question says, who are hurting at the moment. And a little bit like when you're on an aeroplane, when you get the safety instruction and the oxygen mask comes, the natural instinct is that you would want to put the oxygen mask on, say, your elderly relative who is next to you or your child. But the instructions are very clear. You put the oxygen mask on yourself first, because only when you are taking in the oxygen are you in the best position to help other people. And I think a lot of people, including the church, they neglect that. We need to be a strong nation first. Charity does begin at home. And if we're a strong nation, we can also be a good nation. If we are a weak nation, it's difficult to be anything.
Yeah, I think that really translates into some of the comments made by, those who are from immigrant heritage who are anti-mass migration, because they say, well, we came to live in this country and now it is being transformed into something that it wasn't when our families chose to come here. So what do you think, while we're sort of on the topic of those who are further to the right than reform, what do you think of those who are, marching in political protests with crosses? Are you more inclined to agree with the bishops that this is a politicization of Christianity that is unwanted, or do you think actually people should be more understanding of where those people are coming from?
To be honest, I don't know much about those marches. I'm not a natural marcher. People on the right generally aren't natural marchers. I prefer a podcast studio, a little bit like here with you, to make arguments. When we launched the Reformed Christian Fellowship in the city at St. Michael's, Cornhill last week, it was all about worshipping God. It was all about celebrating Christmas. There wasn't I don't think there was a political agenda other than the fact that we were Reformed. Tommy Robinson is a step too far for me. I think he 90% of what he says I would probably agree with, but the 10% I find toxic, and I find some of the history of violence that he's been associated with, I think, is a step too far. And one of the things I do not think Nigel Farage gets anywhere near adequate credit for is he polices the right in a way that Jeremy Corbyn never policed the left. Jeremy Corbyn was always incredibly indulgent of allowing anti-Semites and other extremists to be part of the movement that he's now forming, whatever it's now called, and the Labour Party when he led it. Nigel Farage is very good, not always perfectly or as fast as some people would like, but if we encounter someone with racist or extremist views, he deals with them. And it's one of the reasons why I feel very comfortable in reform.
One of the criticisms of the Christian Fellowship, to sort of pivot back to that specifically, one of the criticisms online has been that this is an Americanization of our politics, that it's somehow un-British. What would you say to those people?
Well, it was actually Tim Farron, the Liberal Democrat former leader, who encouraged me to form this fellowship. Now, so is Tim Farron encouraging an Americanization? I don't know. Of course, the Tim Farron story, I think, is one of the most interesting stories of anyone. You will know it, but for those of your listeners who don't, is that he, when he was Liberal Democrat leader, took a position where he said he would not change the abortion laws, he would not change the laws on homosexual marriage and things like that. But it wasn't enough for the secularist fundamentalists in his party and in the media. They wanted to peer into his soul and know where he stood on those issues. They needed him to say what he clearly wouldn't say because he didn't believe it, that abortion was right or whatever. And I think that many Christians would conclude from looking at the experience of Tim Farron, politics is not a place for me. And I think that would be a really sad position, because if you look at what Christians have done in politics down the ages, whether it's the forgiveness of third world debt, whether it's the civil rights movement in America, well, I think the civil rights movement didn't go crazy, and the civil rights movement, when it believed in what Martin Luther King did, which is everyone be judged on the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin, Christian involvement in politics, I think, has largely been a good force. And why we set this up isn't to import necessarily American politics or whatever. American Christians get some things right, some things I wouldn't have the same emphasis as them. But no, this is about saying that if you're a Christian, politics is a good place for you to be involved with. And, you know, throughout most of history, throughout most of the world today, the natural position for most people is a belief in God. It's not a belief in the secular liberalism. So actually, those people who think that Christians should be out because the natural order is a secular atheism, an atheism, they are the people out of line with most people in the world and most people here. So I think having Christian fellowships in all the political parties, and I would try not to judge other Christians and other parties, that actually is the natural way, natural order, not some kind of aberration.
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private internet access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private internet access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
And of course, up until the midway through the last century, Christianity had been so fundamental and central in our politics that it shaped all of our institutions, it shaped our constitution. Now, our monarchy, in a really profound sense, is still a sacral monarchy.
100%.
And you mentioned the sort of story of Tim Farron, but also Tony Blair very famously said, "We don't do God."
Yeah.
Obviously,
Was it Alistair Campbell who said it on his behalf, I think? Or was it Tony Blair
possibly
himself?
it was. Maybe I'm getting it wrong. I think it was Tony.
It was Alistair Campbell, but
but clearly we now do God in politics in this country. What do you think has changed? Is this maybe a response to the increasing sort of prevalence of Islam in British politics, and so it's become very clear that actually the position of the state's sort of secularity, as it were, isn't coming from a neutral place, but is actually coming from a Christian place, and so that's something that needs to be reasserted. What do you think has changed that has led the country more broadly to be able to have conversations about God in public around the dinner table in a way that I think whilst I was growing up would have been a little bit taboo, a little bit icky?
I think there are more than one things happening at the same time. I actually think, I don't know what church you may attend, but
I'm an Anglican for my sins.
is that I think there is church growth happening at the moment. More people do seem to be going to church. It's not huge, but it's measurable. And interestingly and very unusually, it seems to be more a male phenomenon than a female phenomenon. Something's happening. I always have these senior moments, Emma, but the Canadian philosopher who's written all these books that have influenced men, Jordan Peterson, he, I think he's had an influence on that, actually. I think he's taught the Bible to a new generation in an interesting way, and to men in particular. I think obviously leave room for the Spirit to have, people have been praying for revival for a long time, and hopefully, almost certainly that's
God often gets forgotten.
God often gets forgotten the role that he played, and that's been so much in my own Christian journey. When I've tried to do it on my own strength, I haven't done as well as when I surrendered to God. So that's another thing. But there is something, and there's good and bad to this. You look at it, for example, in Hungary. Hungary is probably one of the most obvious manifestations of this. I don't think there's a real belief and growth in what I would call authentic, personal Christian belief. But there is a belief in a Christian culture. Some people call it Christian nationalism. And people worry about the Islamification of Europe. And I think there is definitely partly as a response that the growing sort of Christian rhetoric and the identification of certain politicians with Christianity is partly that. But of course, it isn't just a right-wing phenomenon. When you have people like Richard Dawkins, who are definitely not on the right of politics, and an atheist saying he'd rather have a Britain, a Europe where Christianity is the dominant flavour of society rather than Islam. I think, there is a contest of ideas. I do believe I'm a Christian, and I do believe in the uniqueness of Jesus Christ, and therefore I wouldn't want to overjudge Muslims, but I have lots of questions about Islam, and I think generally we talked about the volume of immigration earlier. I do worry that in the past, most of the people who've wanted to come to Britain have wanted to come to Britain because they liked what they saw and they wanted to be part of what we were. I wonder now whether we have allowed too many people to come to our country thinking that they could change us, and that there weren't some basic foundational requirements of them in coming, including freedom of speech, speaking English, etc., and separation of church and state, that they perhaps they should have been expected to sign up to and haven't been.
We obviously think that Christianity is true and beneficial for society, but would Reform have, say, a Muslim fellowship in the same way that it has a Christian fellowship?
Well, I don't think there is one at the moment, but I think there perfectly could be. We have Zia Yusuf, probably alongside Nigel Farage, the most important person in Reform, a committed Muslim, a brilliant man, and I'm very glad he's there, at the top of the party. So absolutely, Muslims are welcome in Reform. There's plenty of Muslims. I met them a lot, quite a few of them at
Cunningham.
Indeed, yeah, another one. And met quite a lot of them in Birmingham. And it is interesting. I began by saying I used to run the Conservative Christian Fellowship. And during William Hague's time as Tory leader, I ran the Listening to Britain's Churches exercise, which is our way of consulting the churches. And I met other faith communities as part of that consultation. And nearly always, they much prefer, Muslim people, Jewish people, Sikh people, they much preferred the idea that there was a Christian ethos at the heart of the country than a secular ethos. And so I hope that if I sit down with a Muslim, I will make the case for Jesus Christ, and they will make a counter case. But I would want them in Reform. I've, absolutely, my vast experience of Muslim people is they're good people. Don't agree with a lot of the teachings of Islam, or some of the teachings of Islam at any rate. But no, I hope they're in Reform, and that we can have that. We can have the religious discussion
It's
on the margins of campaigning and putting leaflets through letterboxes and the rest of it.
Yes, it's a long way from the idea that, people's religious sentiments should somehow be privatized and not involved in politics at all. And it's a strange quirk of polling that actually non-Christians tend to be in favor of church establishments, which I think is probably counter to what most people would expect. Pivoting back slightly to the point that you made about cultural Christianity, some people would say, have people identifying as cultural Christians is shallow, it's not enough. Some people have been quite critical of it because it's not sort of full-throated enough.
Yeah.
What's your view of the good or the bad of sort of taking the cultural Christian position rather than an explicitly confessional position?
Well, if I had to name a book of the century so far, it would be, now this is my second senior moment of this podcast, it would be Dominion by Tom Holland.
Yes.
Tom, just recovered just in time, of Tom Holland.
Spider-Man.
No, not yeah, exactly. Wretched politics man for me. You don't follow
History.
Wretched history. Oh my God, that was definitely not wretched politics. No, wretched history. Yeah. Dear me, thank you for being more awake.
Terrible insult.
Being more awake than I am. And we are so blessed to have church attendance is quite low in Britain now. I think Christian literacy in our institutions is quite low. I remember the one battle I failed to win when I was comment editor of the Times was I wanted sort of more religion and Christianity on the pages. My editor, brilliant editor, John Witherow, he said, no, people aren't interested in religion anymore. And that was the one thing we always clashed on. He was so wrong about that. He was basically the best editor I've ever worked under, but he was so wrong about that. And I think a general increasing interest in the Christian roots of our country, however it comes about, I welcome.
Is that a role that the fellowship will play within reform and also within politics more broadly to kind of increase the literacy of how Christianity has informed our constitutional ecosystem?
Yeah.
And the contributions that it's made? I mean, you mentioned the contribution that Christianity made in abolishing slavery.
Yeah.
Very often by radical activists on the left, Christianity gets painted as part and parcel as being, in fact, even by the church itself.
Yeah.
The Church of England painted as being complicit in slavery.
It partly was, but like most of us who sin, it's not whether you sin, it's whether you repent and put the consequences of your errors right. That's what matters. So yes and no is the answer to your question. I don't think we will do corporate campaigns. But what I hope we'll do, if we encourage each other, if we network with each other, I think we will help to individually and perhaps so I'll give you an example, is that when I ran the Conservative Christian Fellowship, we had an annual Wilberforce lecture where we invited someone in public life in the Conservative Party to give a lecture talking about what they learned from Wilberforce, what they would say as a Christian. So I hope we will, I don't know, probably can't use the Wilberforce because that would be unfair on the Conservative Christian Fellowship. But I'd like for that we had an annual lecture, whereas one of the members of the party, not necessarily a Christian, but perhaps a Christian, would talk about an issue of the day and how, Wilberforce or a modern day Wilberforce might confront it. So I hope that will improve literacy. We want to encourage Christians to stand for office. I hope that we will have debates, perhaps with other Christian fellowships, about explaining that question. Can you be a Christian and reform? But perhaps I should ask your opinion on what we should be doing as well. But we will be, we had a good number of people already join. And you can go, by the way, to, if anyone's interested, the Christian Fellowship for Reform. If you Google it, you can join via the Reform Party website. And I hope we'll listen to our new members and we'll come up with ideas of increasing that Christian literacy inside Reform, outside Reform, and maybe get into one or two battles with those Anglican bishops you were mentioning earlier.
Oh, delightful. So long gone are the days of Tim Farron having to sort of throw in the towel because of his Christian faith. One of the
Well, certainly, I think it's still a problem on the left, actually. Emma. I don't know whether.
But it's interesting that it's
Yeah.
a problem on the left when it comes to Christianity, but it's not a problem on the left when it comes to Islam. They're very encouraging of Islam's role in politics, and actually the left often sort of skip hand in hand with Islamist types. But it's interesting that, I mean, I saw a tweet the other day said, I can't remember who it was, tweeted saying that, you know, what is it with our society that Christianity gets mistaken for Islam and Islam gets mistaken for Christianity? Why do you think it is that the left are more comfortable with the expression of Islam in politics than they are with Christianity?
Well, it's a huge question. I think at a basic level, and this is maybe a challenge to the right to some extent, but the history of most immigrant communities, certainly in the early years in which they settled in a society, is the left have generally been more welcoming to immigration. And in most countries in the world, the evidence is that immigrant populations tend to vote left. And so I think there has been an element in which the Islamic communities, as some of the biggest waves of immigration to the country, have been on the left of British politics. And it was always a challenge. I talked earlier about when I was doing faith outreach for the Conservative Party. It was, and this is a hard thing to say, but it is true, is in my outreach to Islam and Muslims in particular, we would agree on so many issues, from family to abortion to religious freedom. And then the issue of Israel would keep coming up. And this was, way before the recent events in Gaza. And there is something about a lot of Islamic attitudes to Israel that has been a problem for centre-right parties who are generally more pro-Israel than centre-left parties. And I've never quite come to terms with it or understood it, but I do think it's a big part of what the left represents.
Although it's interesting, on the left, they have a very specific problem of having this idea of intersectionality that just simply doesn't work in practice. That when Islam comes into conflict with LGBTQ, X whatever issues, when it comes into conflict with women's rights, the left don't have a solution for that conflict. They have to take one side or the other. And actually, electorally, there might have been reasons why the left sided with Islam to the detriment of those, particularly for minorities within minorities. They just sort of swept them aside and focused more on supporting the religiously conservative Muslim community. But actually now that's coming back to bite them in the form of these independent candidates who are taking enormous chunks out of their majorities. I mean, some of the most senior figures in the Labour Party, like Wes Streeting, Naz Shah, their minorities were slashed dramatically by these candidates. Do you think that will make a difference to the stance that the left take when it comes to the place of Islam in politics?
Well, I think there has been inadequate challenge from the left for Islam to be modernized to some extent. Christianity had to go through its reformation. It had to go through a period of reconciling with the Catholic Church, through much of history, was too closely entwined with the state. And I think knowing how to what to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God to what is God's, that is something that Christianity has always, not throughout history, always been good at. It became too politicized. I think Islam is too politicized now, and I think the left's connection with that has furthered that. But I think there are moments. I don't know if you saw the end of the Your Party conference, the Jeremy Corbyn, Zara Sultana, or whether Zara Sultana is still part of it, I don't know anymore. But at the end of the conference recently, they played John Lennon's Imagine. And a lot of the Muslims there were not happy, with the line about imagine an ideal world without religion. And I wonder whether a reckoning's coming. I wonder whether the modern left can continue to have its alliance with Islam in the same way, or whether there will need to be some sort of challenge. But what certainly, I think, I'm not a conservative anymore, but I think one of the most challenging and I think quite concerning things Kemi Badenoch has said since that she became a Conservative leader was that she said, 5 sectarian MPs were elected at the last general election. It could be 20 next time. And by far the worst thing is if a lot of the Muslim population of the UK leave mainstream politics and go into a ghetto in some sort of political. So that, I think, is one of the most worrying developments of British politics.
I think our politics is obviously changing dramatically, and at least Christianity has this idea of rendering unto Caesar the things which is Caesar. Islam doesn't have that, so it's difficult to see in what direction any kind of reformation might take it. But just coming back to the fellowship. Specifically. Now, Sarah Potchin was at the forefront of that video of the Carol service, and a lot of people were commenting, I think rightly pointing out, well, how can you square voting for the assisted dying bill and also being publicly Christian? How does that work?
Okay, well, look, I'm going to answer this question. I would not have voted for the assisted dying bill. I am so proud that Danny Kruger has joined Reform. And I'm so proud of him. He's been a friend of mine now for 25 years. And he led the campaign beautifully, I thought. And I mean beautifully, in terms of generous to opponents, intellectually on fire. So I'm with him on this issue, not with Sarah Potchin. But I'm going to mention William Wilberforce again, okay? And William Wilberforce, he first of all began with a campaign not against slavery, but against the slave trade. Because he thought that was possible. And so many Christians attacked him at the time. And they said, slave trade is one thing, but all of slavery is evil. Why aren't you opposing slavery? Now, 27 of those 40 years I mentioned earlier were spent abolishing the slave trade. And there were many reverses on the way. As soon as the slave trade was abolished, he began the campaign to abolish slavery. And that was always it. Now, I think sometimes Christians look outside from politics and they judge people inside politics and they don't know some of the compromises that. Sarah Potchin, I think she's wrong on assisted suicide, but I know that she's right. She wrote a letter with the other 4 Reform MPs this week and criticising the government's plan to test puberty blockers on children. I'm grateful that Sarah's there on that issue. I'm not with her on that issue. I think one thing we need to allow in Christianity is some grace to disagree. It does not say in the Bible how much investment we should put in motorways versus airports, or how much we should spend on health versus education. And as I say, I think Sarah Potchin is wrong about the assisted dying bill, but I'm not going to judge her what goes on inside her head and what goes on inside her heart on one issue.
Yeah, I think it's very theologically sound to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Christianity is inherently anti-ideological, in my opinion, in some ways. So what do you think of those who, you might describe it as being further to the right. I'm not sure how you would quite put this on the spectrum, but there is a disagreement from both critics and advocates who say that Christianity's involvement in politics will lead to persecution. It will lead to a coercive confessional state. Obviously, you disagree with that if you think that Christianity actually is, it seems, you're saying, is inclined towards accepting a diversity of opinions, maybe within reason.
Yeah. Look, Nick Robinson, the BBC's Nick Robinson, in the aftermath of the shootings in Sydney, he stood up for the Jewish community quite rightly. There is a darkness at the moment towards Jews in so many societies, which worries. But he also said we should worry about backlash against the Muslim community as well. And he got a lot of criticism for that. Nick Robinson was right to say what he said. I'm a Christian, and I've probably said some things today to you about Islam that some people think, well, that's a bit judgmental. I do not back Islam. I am a Christian. But I back the freedom of Muslims to be Muslim and Jews to be Jews. And I think it's incredibly important, actually, that if you have a sacred canopy over a society, provided in the way that we have, an Anglican Christian, that we stand for the freedom of other religions as well. So I regard it as one of, it's a canary in the coal mine. If you start seeing persecution of religious minorities, It's a warning that and you see this in society, through history, again and again and again. Start persecuting certain religions, other freedoms fall very soon afterwards. So not only do I think there's a Christian obligation to stand with others who are being persecuted, it's a Christian obligation to be in favor of freedom, to be in favor of freedom of religion. So that I can understand why people have that fear, because there've been plenty of times in history when Christians have been part of persecution. But I think Christianity is different from what it was. I certainly hope so.
Well, in the spirit of reasonable disagreement amongst Christians,
Yeah.
I agree with you about freedom of religion, and I think that Christianity uniquely supports that. But I actually agree with the critics of Robinson for, bringing that into his statement, because I think, at least from the perspective of the Jewish community, they are the ones who are facing these threats, and I think people rightly, wouldn't you agree, say, why can't you just mention the Jewish community? Why do you always have to mention Islam? Why do you always have to mention backlash against Muslims? Why can't this just be about the Jewish community? Why do you have to make this into a broader thing?
Well, let me say,
it's sensitive in some way.
Well, I think he was sensitive. So we'll carry on our gentle, respectful disagreement. My faith in God and in Christianity has changed in various ways over the years. I'm not quite as when I was young, I knew everything, how young people do. And I had God in a box. I don't have God in a box. He's more, I would describe myself less as a Christian now, but as a follower of Jesus, because I want the focus of my life to be on him. And also the follower of Jesus almost implies a journey, because I'm learning all the time. And sometimes I'm closer to faith and sometimes I'm further apart. So I'm learning all the time. And I'm losing track of what I was going to say. But in that sort of oh yes, that's what I was going to say. So although my faith in Christianity has not always been the same, one thing that I have found more and more true is a belief in the darkness in the world. There is something evil in the world. And one of the most evil things of all is anti-Semitism. Throughout history, it's the ancient hatred. Throughout history, throughout different continents, the Jews have been hated by certain sections of society in a way that I cannot fully explain, other than it comes from something almost beyond us and outside us. I think it's satanic. So I will always say the hatred for Jews is something uniquely evil. But who was it, in Sydney, who wrestled one of the gunmen to the ground? It was a Muslim. And we do know, although the hatred for the Jews is particularly horrible and particularly a problem at the moment, is there have been attacks on mosques throughout Britain as well. That Muslims will get the backlash to some extent because of what happened in Sydney. And so I absolutely think it was right for Nick Robinson to say what he said, which is to stand by Muslims at this time as well. We need to look after each other. I will have that argument with a Muslim about Islam. But when the majority of Muslims would have hated what happened in Sydney as much as anyone else, I think we would need to be worried about their protection as well.
If I may end with two more personal biographical questions about you. I'm interested to know what your personal journey was to Christianity. Were you always a Christian? Were you a cradle Christian, or is this something you came to later in life?
Apparently at the age of about 6 or 7, my parents didn't go to church. And I said, why don't we go to church? And so we started to go to church. And I think we were sort of churchgoers, but not necessarily believers for most of those years. But when I was a sort of a teenager, we went to a Baptist event, and someone preached the message from C.S. Lewis. At some point, everyone in their life has to decide who Jesus was, because there was only 3 options. He was either mad to claim he was the Son of God, he was bad to claim he was the Son of God, or he was who he said he was. And at that moment, me, my dad, my mum, and my sister all went forward and committed our lives to Jesus. And I've changed in different ways since then. Things aren't as clear for me. Issues like homosexuality, I'm not so sure about as I was in the past. Lots of abortion, I've stayed absolutely resolute. I've not wavered on that issue. So some of the political implications of faith have changed, but that's how I became a Christian.
And what about reform? What was it that led you to sort of, I mean, as you know, I recently also went from being a member of
Welcome
Conservatives
aboard.
to
Welcome
member of
aboard. What took it so long? What took you so long?
That's what everybody's been saying. And that wasn't an easy decision for me to make, even though I'm not really a sort of party political person, but you were much more involved in the Conservative Party than I ever was. I mean, you're founder of Con Home. It's quite a significant decision for you to decide to sort of put all your chips on a new party. What was the thing for you that sort of just pushed you over the edge?
Yeah, well, it was so many more than one thing. And someone recently, a recent convert, even more recent than you, I think, said to me, "Do you ever regret joining Reform?" And I said, "Every day."
And that's very healthy.
Yeah,
it's very healthy.
Because it's a tightrope, and I don't know whether Reform is going to succeed. I think if we had a presidential system or a gubernatorial system or mayoral system, I think Nigel Farage would absolutely win. But putting in place 350 plus candidates is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy, and it may not work. But the issue to bring those two things together, it was when the immigration figures came out for how the last immigration numbers of the Tory period in government, they promised election after election at the Brexit referendum they would control immigration. They never did. And if you are a Conservative and one of your fundamental beliefs is taking responsibility for your own actions, the Conservative Party needs to take responsibility for what it did and what it didn't do. And the 14 years of Conservative government that began with Cameron and ended with Sunak, they were not good years for this country. And in comparison to what made me a Conservative, the Thatcher Major years, they were amazing years for this country. And so I joined Reform because I absolutely believe in Nigel. I think he is the most extraordinary politician of our generation. If anyone can turn this country around, it's him. But it's not going to be easy. But I did decide that the Conservative Party had forfeited my trust and my confidence. And I think a lot of people are in the same boat.
I think Christianity there's always a slight ambivalence about anything political. It doesn't endorse one particular political system. It doesn't, it leads you to actually have quite a critical perspective of politics. And I wonder whether actually having the Christian fellowship within Reform, and particularly if it is increasingly vocal, might actually act as a sort of leaven for internal criticism within the party and create a sort of more healthy dynamic.
Well, I did say when I joined, I handed over my 25 quid to Nigel. I said, a bit like someone else I'm not so far away from at the moment. I said, "Do you really sure you want me in the party?" Because I gave the Tories a lot of aggro, hopefully constructive, and that's what I'll do in Reform. But I think internal debate's important. I think you need to be loyal to the leader, and unless they are, way out of line, you need to be constructive and helpful and play your part in positive contribution to the party. But no one gets it right all the time, and we need to the issues that face Britain are more profound, I think, than they've been at any time, certainly since the 1970s, perhaps since the end of the Second World War. And if in that situation you aren't debating every issue in a profound way, then you're not grown up. You're not serious. It's
a very good note to leave it on. Thank you so much, Tim Montgomerie. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know what you think in the comments to stay up to date with all of GB News' content.